Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group. It is Saturday the 2nd of May, and you're joined by myself, Philip Nothard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson. So we're on episode 345. So welcome to the show, everyone, and a warm welcome to our growing number of new listeners.
So we need to keep getting caught out with these episodes now, don't we? With the midweek special COVID-19 specials that we're having as well. So we've had a great one this week with Lee Swinerd, who is the part of the automotive advisory team over at KPMG. And if you haven't listened to it, I would say have a good listen to that, because it was quite an insightful and informative view at the wider market in terms of that upstream and downstream, in terms of the challenges and opportunities from a manufacturer perspective, and obviously that tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 supplier side of the market that nobody really thinks about, do they?
No, you're right, and it is an eye opener, and it does tie in. I mean, it is very timely because he does talk about the ramifications of the OEMs reopening their factories and what that will actually look like, and what it will mean to dealers. So it's a great insight. So do stay tuned for that, because that will be at the end of the headlines.
It will, and it's the 7th in the series, and since lockdown, and we've had obviously Robert Forrester, Darren Edwards, Umish, Mike Jones, and others. I'm trying to think of all the others and losing track of who we've had on and when
we had Christian L. Thors from Volvo UK, the boss there, and Nathan Tomlinson from Devonshire Motors. So and more to come next week.
There is, yeah. So I mean, have a listen. Like I say, the Lee Swinerd one from KPMG is at the end of this show if you've not managed to catch it this week. And if you head over to the motortraderadio.com website, the previous episodes are there, or they're on Spotify and the other download channels that you can access as well. So, but we have got some shout outs this week of some of the good things that have been happening in our sector, and we've had to be fairly selective, haven't we, because there's a lot of good activity taking place around COVID-19 and helping the industry and helping the key workers, etc. So we've selected 2 this week to share with you.
Yeah, and this was in response to we put out a message on LinkedIn during the week saying, look, if you're doing anything to help the key workers, then let us know and we'll give you a shout out. So the first one is from Julian Stockton, who's the sales director at Angus McKinnon, which is an independent dealer in Uttoxeter in Staffordshire. And he got in touch via Twitter saying they've been busy supplying seat covers and gloves to the local care community, and they've also supplied several delivery vans to local food businesses so that they can do home food deliveries even to local vulnerable people. They've also carried on servicing, repairing and MOTing delivery vans, NHS and key worker cars. So big shout out there for Julian Stockton and the team at Angus McKinnon.
And we have got a second one, and this came from Minu over at Westway Nissan, who's the marketing project manager over there at Westway, and they've been busy. I mean, they's talking about loaning 30 Nissan vehicles free of charge to the NHS workers, and around the some of the paramedics, so the doctors and nurses down at Nightingale Hospital, doctors on the rapid response teams of COVID-19 cases. They've loaned a couple of Nissan Navara trucks to Team Rubicon UK, who have also been supporting the relief efforts in the variety of ways, from supplying food to the NHS and others, and constructing face visors and helping to build Nightingale Hospital. So, and again, one or two other things, lending a Navara NV300, to the Barn Kitchen, who are delivering 40,000 meals to the NHS staff in Coventry and Warwickshire. And they also loaned a Nissan NV200 to a charity called Walking with the Wounded, who are made up of volunteers from the armed forces community, again to deliver food and essentials for those in the community. And they do go on that obviously they are also offering special discounts on service with a free wash and vac and other things to help the sector out. So again, just a couple of some of the great work that's going on in the industry to help those on the front line and needed as we find our way through this pandemic.
Yeah, and if you want to shout out next week, then just contact myself or Philip on social media and tell us what you're doing.
Exactly. So we better get on to this week's headlines, Curtis. So we've had a few, and car dealer have been busy, we must say. I mean, fantastic shout out to James Baggett on some of the work he's been putting in, and I think you were pointing out before the show, it's kind of on his own doing a lot of this as well, I suspect.
Well, I mean, his byline is appearing on a lot of stories, so I suspect he is doing a lot on his own at the moment. So, and he is doing a very, very good job. So the first headline is from Car Dealer, and it's car manufacturers unfairly pushing dealers to start delivering cars following government clarification they can sell online. It's a long headline because Car Dealer likes long headlines. But it does tell the story. So this is really a follow-up to the story we talked about last week, which was the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, BEIS, clarifying what dealers can do. So the stated position was that dealers can supply cars online and they can do home deliveries as long as they adhere to self-distancing rules and regs. And this is Car Dealer reporting on what some of the car manufacturers, how they've reacted to this, and some interesting comments from one dealer saying the manufacturers we represent have been breathing down our neck as they desperately want us to start delivering cars. They need cash to flow back into their businesses as much as we do, which is it's an interesting observation. It does actually tie in with the interview at the end of this program, where we've got Lee Swinerd from KPMG talking about the ramifications for OEMs restarting and what that means to dealers. So this is a story I suspect that we'll be revisiting.
Well, yeah, and obviously, I mean, there's a quote in there from Robert Forrester, who's obviously been very vocal on the the return to business and how it can be done, etc. But talking about that click and collect, and not necessarily home delivery, and the challenges with this is that following that announcement from the BIS, I mean, you're dealing with manufacturers across the international and European sector, and each country are operating in different ways. And what they can and can't do around restrictions, and obviously there are even different protocols around social distancing from country to country. So again, you've got European or international manufacturers reading an announcement or what has been restriction lifted or a perception of the rules, should we say, and taking what they want to take from that, and like I say, expecting some of these dealers just to be back up and running to normal business. And as we know, it's not the case. We discussed in a little bit of detail last week. There is a difference between one car being handed over at home and an AM100 multi-franchise group doing it on scale. There are obviously different procedures and protocols around that, so very interesting. And as you say, Curtis, I think this will be one that we will be obviously revisiting from week to week, I suspect, as we go through it.
Yeah, and you're right, because it seems as though the assumption is that it's more or less business as usual, and that dealers are geared up to supply cars online and deliver them. Where, of course, they're not, because there's an awful lot of staff on furlough at the moment. Whilst some dealers have kept their service departments going, that they haven't kept the sales departments going. So there's a lot to do to get everything in place before home deliveries can be considered in any great volumes.
Definitely. And the next story is one that appeared, and this is a first for the podcast, which is in Business Live. And this is a headline around Robert Forrester again, and Virtue brings back staff after seeing demand for service and new cars. So linking into what you've just been saying there, that Robert is bringing an element of his staff back in certain areas, isn't he?
Yeah, and across Virtue, they've brought around 1,000 staff back to work. With some repairing vehicles for key workers and others, and other people needing cars. So, as it stands, 90% of sites are open for service work, and Virtue is also selling a number of cars online, which it can deliver to customers' homes. While it's, and this is an interesting point that Robert made when he was on the podcast, probably about three and a half weeks ago, something like that. That a lot of the contact centre based in Gateshead are operational, and that they are working from home. So it's showing how Virtue is getting up and running again. And as you said in the last story, Robert Forrester isn't a fan of click and deliver. I think the model he foresees is click and come to the dealership to collect, but I think that's still a work in progress.
Yeah, and you can understand that. It's a lot easier to control the environment, isn't it? Not necessarily just for the customer, but obviously for your colleagues and staff as well, which obviously there's an area of responsibility there that, you've got a responsibility towards your staff and your colleagues to make sure that they're in a safe environment and it's a controlled environment, which is key to this at the minute. So we'll move on to the next story, and this is quite an in-depth story covering quite a few areas from AM Online, and great story again as usual from Tom there. And it's that COVID-19 car retail recovery like starting a completely new business. And actually I think that headline comes directly out of our friend Clive Brook at Clive Brook Volvo, isn't it? And his views on what it's going to be like when we do get restrictions lifted and get back to some kind of business transactions taking place. And he's quoted in there that it's like starting again, isn't it? So
yeah, and this follows the last two stories, and it's about what happens next and what will the new normal look like. And he does say there's every chance that the majority of dealer visits will have to be by appointment. And Clive Brook goes on to describe the recovery process as being financially more painful than being closed. And this is because when do you unfurlough staff that you've already furloughed? And it's doing the right thing at the right time in the right order, and meanwhile waiting until the lockdown is fully lifted.
Yeah, so there's 40. What has he got? He's got 43 of his business 65 staff are on furlough, so he's got 22 of his staff working across his sites across Huddersfield and Bradford there. And as you say, it's not. You've got to, there's this balance of taking, I think we discussed it last week, Curtis, that balance of taking people off furlough before the 3-week minimum period, of which then you incur the full cost of the salary, and making sure that there's, the business is there to cover it. Because if not, you just end up increasing your cost base with no income revenue to cover any of it. So it's a fine balance at the minute, and getting that right as we turn to market is key for any business, not just the retailers. I think that is key for any business, is getting that return to market right, that you you're not just incurring more debt as a consequence.
And the full quote is, Clive Brook described his plan for reopening as like starting a new business with your hands tied behind your back. So it just shows the challenges that dealers are facing across the country.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to the next story now, and returning to Car Dealer, and Mr. Baggott does seem to be pulling out some of these exclusives, and I mean this appeared late in the evening, wasn't it, from James on the website?
Yeah, I was quite impressed because this did appear in the evening. Now, most of the stories at the moment are being posted pretty much during office hours, but I think James must have been staying on a little later that evening. And this is, as you say, the DVLA confirming that dealers who hold official trade plates and are properly insured are allowed to let potential buyers test drive cars without having to send one of their salespeople or a member of staff with them when the lockdown actually lifts. So this is welcome news for the sector. But I guess the big caveat is about checking your insurance and making sure that your policy does cover this, because chances are, as it stands at the moment, your policy probably doesn't.
Yeah, and I mean this comes from a few things, and it's they've pulled it from the communication that was taken between IMDA, and the particular Umesh Samani who was on the show a couple of weeks back actually, and some of the work that they've been doing to try and get clarification from the DVLA on this, and they managed to get some clarification and quickly got it out to their members and the wider market, so just to give them some confirmation of what can and can't be done around the tray plates. And there is it's a very interesting one, this one, because I think the tray plate generally is kind of this one that it's had so many changes in recent years about how you can use tray plates and the rules and regulations about displaying them, and I think there's been a lot more confusion around the tray plates and usage of tray plates than there has been clarity in recent years. But Umesh, who's the chairman of the IMDA, said that the DVLA guidelines for tray plates use has always been that a motor dealer or their employee must be present whilst using tray plates, and dealers sending customers out on their own before this might have been not realised that they were actually breaking the rules at the time. And I suspect many would just put a set of tray plates on a car and let the customer go out on their own when it wasn't the correct usage of the tray plates.
Yeah, you're right, and I actually think this move will resonate with a lot of buyers who are nervous about taking a test drive with a member of staff. That addresses that nervousness. So this is definitely a step in the right direction. Yeah,
and just another announcement from the IMDA as well. They've had 2 new appointments to their board as well, and the first one is Brett Wills, who some people listening may recognise. He's actually an automotive consultant and buyer, and recently he's been on a couple of webinars with people like MHA and one or two others, and he was previously the managing director of Saxon Bridge Automotive Limited before joining there, and he's joined the board over at the IMDA, and they've also appointed Phil Buchan. I think I've correctly spelled these, but he's also joined the board, and he's the sales manager up at Jim Reed Vehicle Sales, and brings a lot of experience around that social media as well, and what's happening there. So well done to those two guys joining the board of the IMDA.
Yeah, lots going on at the IMDA.
Yes. So we've got a few more stories as well to hit, which are quite connected, aren't they, Curtis? But we'll quickly take a break there.
Yep. So you're listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group, the only weekly podcast serving the car retailing sector, and available online at motortraderadio.com and by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Deezer, and SoundCloud. Now, the next story, this actually broke just before we started recording the show, and it's from Car Dealer again.
It is, yeah.
Although, in fairness, the story did pop up on LinkedIn first. So the headline from Car Dealer is Pendragon boss Trevor Finn reveals he is plotting return to industry with launch of used car proposition.
Yeah, so again, for those that thought Trevor were gone, he hasn't. And he has actually, this is, they say, from a LinkedIn post or an article actually by Trevor himself, and life after Pendragon. And obviously it goes into some of his history around his time with Pendragon and the size of the group, etc., and some of the dates around when they floated an entrance into the US market, etc. But as you say, Curtis, I mean, right at the end there, which is obviously where Car Dealer Mag and James again over at Car Dealer Mag has immediately focused, was that he just drops it in there at the end that he is returning to the used car market. Yeah,
so he's been out of the sector for just over 12 months, because he was restricted under existing clauses, but that's all passed now. So he's hinting about what he's doing next. So so what he's saying is that he's been busy understanding the evolution of new and used car distribution and considering his future part in that. And this has involved him in no fewer than 25 trips to European and US markets, which he said has reaffirmed what he sees as a significant opportunity for used car profit growth. So there's the big clue there. He's coming back.
I'm not sure it's a clue. I think it's a point of intention, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, it's a statement of intent. He's coming back with the used car business, and he goes on to say, "I'm excited to say that I will be launching the next chapter very soon. Watch this space, but for now, I wish your family and loved ones well at this time." So this is going to be fascinating to see what the proposition is.
I mean, what an interesting way to announce it as well.
Yeah.
In terms of he's had quite a good pickup as well on his LinkedIn article in terms of well wishing and welcoming back and everything. And I think as we've spoken about over the years, Curtis, on the show, when we've had some of the senior leaders that have left the sector by one way or another through retirement, etc., and they do return.
Yes. No one stays away for that long, do they?
No. It is a very interesting sector to try and leave. I think it's in your blood, and it always will be. But I think anybody that has never had dealings with Trevor, I mean, he knows the used car sector inside out, doesn't he? I mean, that time with Pendragon, the highs and the lows through Pendragon, and the challenges that they faced through some of those times. I mean, he's very well rounded with that used car market of the sector, isn't he? So it will be very, very interesting, personally for me as well, interesting to see what proposition he comes back with and how he enters the market again, particularly after, with a period of Brexit and more recently with the COVID-19 as well. And Brexit still isn't defined. It's still to happen next year, isn't it? So been interesting of how he enters the market. I suspect many are exiting after some of this.
Yeah, and I think the timing is interesting as well, because bearing in mind we are on lockdown at the moment, he could have delayed the announcement of this until he knows what's going on in terms of going back to work and businesses starting up again. So it's interesting that he's announced it now rather than waiting. So his ideas must be clearly defined and ready to roll.
And I think Lee, from KPMG, the interview at the end of the show, he says within that interview that out of this, there are challenges and there is going to be risk, but there's also going to be opportunities. And all this that's going on is going to create some opportunities for the sector. Maybe this is one of them. So watch this space, I think, is probably the answer to this one. So we'll move on. We'll go over to motortrader.com, and this is a great news for any dealer out there in the market that eBay Motors extends free support package for dealers into May. So very much needed. Very much, I expect, appreciated and welcomed by the dealer network and for eBay Motors doing this.
Yeah, so this is free classified advertising across eBay Motors, motors.co.uk and Gumtree, and that covers the most recent extension of the government's lockdown, and there's also the removal of over posting fees. That's been extended as well, and in fact the measures will continue for 8 days after showrooms are allowed to reopen. So that's building in a lot of comfort and security for dealers. And they go on to say that these measures will also be applied to any further extension of the lockdown should that happen in May.
No, and again, I mean, it's like anything in these circumstances at the minute. Nobody knows what things are going to look like as we come out of this. But removing some of these things that the retailers need to think about and worry about is welcome news. I think the more of this that can be done, and some of the earlier stories about getting clarification on things and sharing it across the network, which is what is been so prominent, hasn't it, recently, Curtis, that so much knowledge sharing and sharing of insight and information and clarification of things is really what everybody needs, because it brings the industry together and really helps them focus on what they need to focus on. So great news. So moving on to back to AM Online, and this is again Marshall's Motor Group Holdings achieved 6th annual Best Workplaces rankings. So again, huge shout out to these guys. They are in the super large category of the annual Best Workplaces to work, and they achieved 12th place for that. So again, up against some serious operators within that sector, aren't they?
Yeah, up against names like Hilton, Admiral, and Gap, and this is the 6th year running for Marshalls, and they'll be delighted about this, because it's based on responses to questionnaires from the workforce. So, and Marshalls, they've always, for these last 6 years, they've always had very positive rankings, comments from the workforce, but also a high turnout rate, a high response rate to these questionnaires. So well done, Marshalls.
Definitely. We're hoping to get Dash on at some point, aren't we, in one of the COVID-19 specials. So hopefully he can share some of his thoughts around this and why they keep achieving it, and some of the efforts that the group does to maintain it.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much it for this week, isn't it?
It is. I mean, there's a lot of headlines at the minute in there, and a lot of activity taking place. But again, head over to these websites that we've just been talking about there, from Car Dealer, AM, Motor Trader, Auto Retail Network as well, and obviously with the story appearing there from Business Live. So a lot of activity taking place, a lot of good things to support the key workers and support colleagues and staff across the sector. But again, a lot taking place. So again, please don't hesitate if you get anything that you want to shout out on the show, then please drop me or Curtis a note, and we'll gladly give the shout out on the show next week. Whether that's an individual or a team of people or a business that you want to give that shout out to, then please just drop us a quick note, and we'll gladly give them a shout out on the show.
Yeah, so you've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Many thanks for listening. Do join Philip and I again next weekend, and do look out for the latest in our series of special interviews with industry leaders over the course of this coming week. Until then, stay tuned for a special interview we recorded earlier this week with KPMG's Lee Swinerd, giving his unmissable big picture analysis of the challenges facing both OEMs and dealers as car plants start to reopen from this month. Until next time, stay safe, and it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Hello and welcome from me, Philip Nothard and Curtin Hutchinson, to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast, brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Many thanks again for joining us in this seventh in the series of special interviews with industry leaders during the COVID-19 crisis, following recent conversations with Sytner Group's Darren Edwards, Virtue Motors' Robert Forrester, the IMDA's Umesh Salamani, and last week's conversation with Volvo UK MD Christian Elverforce. So all these are available still on the stream online from motortraderadio.com, Spotify and Apple and Google Podcasts.
Now, we're delighted to welcome our special guest today, Lee Swinerd, Managing Director in the advisory practice at KPMG. So welcome to the podcast, Lee. And perhaps you could start by just giving listeners a brief overview of your automotive remit at KPMG.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Curtis. Hi, Phil. And thanks for inviting me onto the show. I'm actually the sector champion for automotive within the restructuring part of of KPMG. And I work very closely with Andrew Byrne, who is the newly appointed head of automotive for the whole of KPMG. I've been involved with the sector for about 10 years now from a consultancy point of view. And I've worked across Europe on the supply chain side, and also sort of dealt with a number of dealers from the very largest to some of the smallest around.
So, welcome, Lee. It's been a while. We're trying to get you on the podcast, so thanks for joining us. I think it's a key time for you joining the podcast. So welcome. Let's start off. We think about with BMW, VW, JLR and FCA amongst many of the OEMs now restarting their European production. What are the main challenges facing some of these OEMs in reopening their car plants during this time?
Yeah, well, one of the main challenges that we've been discussing with people is really around the timing and coordination. The problem you've got, of course, Phil, is that all of these plants are in different countries, and their supply chains equally are in different jurisdictions as well, right? So, Germany is probably ahead of the UK and Italy and Spain and the like from the COVID curve. And so, whilst Germany might want to reopen its plants, it might be difficult because some of their suppliers will be elsewhere and will not be reopening at that point in time because government restrictions, border controls, whatever may stop them from doing that. So that in itself is just a technical and logistical challenge in itself, making sure that all of the supply chain is there and is open. I've just received an email this morning, funnily enough, from a UK-based supplier. The out of office said something like, "We are closed until the 11th of May, full stop." Right. So it's quite tricky for the OEMs to then say, well, okay, unless they've got inventory of parts, which one assumes that with just-in-time production they probably don't have a huge inventory, then you can see it's quite that in itself is just a challenge. One of the other issues that we have as well is, will the suppliers still be there? And well, I'll come on to that a little bit later, I think, and we'll explore that a little bit further about the supply chain side. And then, another area that's going to be quite challenging is, implementing the social distancing measures within a production plant. So I don't know if either of you have ever done a factory tour like around JLR or Ford in Cologne or somewhere. But when you see them operate, a lot of the workers are are operating within 2 meters of each other. They're quite close. They're putting their heads, inside a vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be a real challenge. I've been working with a tier 2 supplier, and they've come back on stream from a production point of view, but their capacity is going to be around about 50% of what it would normally be after they've implemented social distancing, because of the way their production line is set up.
And I suppose you've got things like where the movement of the parts, the panels, and it's on the vehicle itself, passing from one operative to another operative, isn't there? There's all these considerations to take place within a safe working environment, and these plants are huge. It's not like a small dealership, is it, in terms of putting a plan in place in terms of that sort of structure. It's a huge plant that requires a lot of logistical changes.
Yeah, and we've seen, and I've not seen them specifically myself, but a lot of the OEMs and the tier ones are making announcements that they've got these return to work plans, and they're running them past the unions to make sure that the unions and the workers' councils are happy with it, which has got to be right, and it's the way to do it, but even small things that perhaps we talk about the production line, but in some factories, when people do shift change, right, the outgoing shift and the incoming shift walk next to each other, and they shake hands with each other, and say hello to their mates. All of that sort of stuff's going to have to change. The flow of people, where they sit in, and the breaks, in the canteens and stuff like that, where people all sit closely together. All of that's got to be rethought, and it's not simple. And then overlay that with the challenge of getting, presumably part of these plans that people are putting in place, you'll need some form of PPE, perhaps, as a minimum, masks and gloves. Do they have access to that PPE, given, the NHS itself, has difficulties in getting some of that equipment, et cetera, et cetera. You can see it's, the thought process of opening is a good one. The practicalities of actually trying to do it could be quite difficult.
Now, Lee, following on from that, assuming that car plants do open in some shape or form in the not too distant future, how do you think OEMs will start to prioritise which models to start making? Are they going to be the ones with orders attached to them, or maybe the most profitable models? And do you think OEMs will use this as an opportunity to perhaps cull some of their underperforming models?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes to all of those questions, to be honest, Curtis. I think it obviously will make sense to prioritise all vehicle production where you have a known order rather than building for stock, because I'd imagine that a lot of the channels for stock are pretty full for some of the manufacturers, so you don't really want to be making a car if you don't have a known order. The question will be, will the order that you thought was there on the 1st of March, is it still there on the 1st of May? Because a number of businesses, for example, are trimming back their spend for obvious reasons at the moment, and sort of are probably cancelling new car orders, for an example. So the order book may not be quite as robust as it once was. Equally, you can, and this isn't just about automotive, is it, Curtis? Any business would do the same thing. You're going to prioritize your most profitable return that you can get when you manufacture something. So whilst you might make a very high margin on a small volume vehicle, you're probably not going to prioritize that. But equally, you don't want to be mass producing something that loses money every time a vehicle rolls off the production line.
And do you think we'll start to see some models falling off of lineups?
I do. Yeah, I think it's a good opportunity for all businesses. I'm not just talking about automotive here, Curtis, but for all businesses to look at their, their product ranges and prioritize those where they make money. And I don't think the automotive manufacturers will be any different, if I'm completely honest. I do see that some ranges will never be, some vehicles will never be made again. And we saw a little bit of that off the back of WLTP, if you remember, as well, right?
Yeah, and just a follow-up on that, we saw an article today in Autocar about this resupply and what it will look like, and the piece speculated that in the old world, a new order took something in the region of 12 weeks, and the suggestion was that may look like 26 weeks once factories start to reopen. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you could potentially see the timelines pushing out. One of the main reasons will be, I don't think the manufacturers' production lines will operate at 100% capacity because of the partly down to the social distancing type measures that we discussed earlier. I think if your suppliers can only supply 50% of the components, you can only make 50% of the cars, because you can't make a car without all of the components, can you?
Yeah.
And in terms of that, I mean, obviously, as the car plants start to reopen, as there's different dates for different OEMs, as you've been saying, and it's widely sort of publicised now and updated on a regular basis. But in terms of the impact on the supply chain, because that's the bit that not many people, I mean, you've intimated a couple of times there about it, but not many people are talking about that supply chain impact with all of this. There's one thing with the manufacturers opening their productions, their factories, but actually, there's a long chain following them, isn't there, in terms of getting that back up and running again through that supply channel.
Yes, and even if you just focus on the tier one, Phil, and obviously this impacts tier two, tier three, all the way down really as well. But the way that we at KPMG are looking at this is that there are probably three issues, right? Firstly, has a supplier had the liquidity just to get through this initial kind of lockdown period or not, right? Because I'm sure there will be some out there that won't. Okay. The second thing is, plants look like they're going to reopen. A lot of businesses will have burnt through the cash that they did have on the balance sheet, at the start of the lockdown, because, whilst you can furlough people and, shut your factory doors, et cetera, there will still be some costs that still need to be paid, week in, week out. And what that will do then is put real pressure on those suppliers. So will they have enough liquidity to fund the working capital? Because if you're a supplier and you're supplying an OEM, you make a part today, you ship it tomorrow, you get paid for that in 45, 60 days time, typically, right? So you have to fund that working capital period. And that's where all the government support programs in this country and elsewhere around Europe are trying to help these businesses, to fund that working capital. But, that's an area where, again, businesses could fail as a consequence of not having that working capital, not being able to pay the suppliers to get the raw materials to make the parts, et cetera. Now, the manufacturers themselves can obviously help step in and help and support on those bases as well, but the manufacturers are going to have lots and lots and lots of suppliers equally having issues. So, they can't necessarily come in and support everybody. And then the third area is, if you're operating at, I don't know, whether it's 50%, 75% capacity, or whether, volumes from the manufacturers get dialed back, and whether it's, I think the SMMT were looking at a minus 23% sort of new vehicle number for the rest of this year. At minus 23, if the production lines are dialed back to represent that kind of level, most of these suppliers are quite highly geared, or a lot of them are quite highly geared financially, and they need to operate at 90+% operational efficiency. And so if you're running at 75, then they're going to incur losses, and it's how long those businesses can incur those losses for before they run out of liquidity again. So you've got a very here and now problem. You've probably got a kind of a medium term sort of, the next 4 to 12 week problem around liquidity. And then I think you've got another 12 plus month issue around liquidity, all of which will make the whole supply chain very fragile potentially.
And just talking about that, and what an area that we've discussed when we've caught up recently is that some of these, these suppliers, these tier 1, tier 2s, etc., they're not just for one OEM. They are supplying parts for numerous OEMs. Yep. And they're reliant on all those OEMs, requiring that supply. And it only takes one to, one may maintain their volume position and demand for that supply, but actually if another 2 or 3 don't, that has a knock-on effect, doesn't it, across all of them essentially. So there's a challenge there for each of the manufacturers, that they are reliant on other OEMs, aren't they, in a sense?
Yeah, and it goes back to what I said right almost at the beginning, Phil, around coordination and timing. Ideally you would have, and it would never happen because of all the anti-competition laws, etc. But you almost needed all the manufacturers to get their heads together and say, right, okay, we're all going to reopen on the same day, right? And give the supply chain a bit of notice of that. That's an ideal scenario, and clearly it will never happen. But in reality, by not doing that, you're going to cause a lot of stress within the supply chain.
Where one manufacturer, they're wanting that tier 2 or tier 3 supplier to start up because they're ready to go or they need that product, but actually 2 or 3 of the other manufacturers that they also supply aren't ready yet and no short-term plans to reopen, and it'll cause an inefficiency of their supply, won't it? So interesting.
Now, Lee, before the pandemic crisis, there were question marks over some car plants around the world. Do you think the crisis has actually prompted OEMs to run the rule over any underperforming plants, and we may not see all the plants reopening as a result of that?
Again, I think that's correct, Curtis. I go back to what I said earlier, that I think every business, regardless of sector, whether it's automotive, aerospace, food distribution, whatever it happens to be, people are going to be looking at their operational footprint right now, and I don't think the manufacturers are any different. We know that there's an overcapacity generally in the global markets and in Europe as well. We know that there are longer term trends away from ICE powertrains into electric and hybrids, which again are putting European production under threat, etc. So now might be the good time to have those difficult conversations with the unions and the workers' councils and revisit what a manufacturing footprint needs to be on a global basis. Let's not forget that most of these companies do act globally.
Yeah, and in terms of, there's been a few conversations around this, and it would be good to get your view on it. In terms of the pandemic and on the future of mobility trends, like the car sharing, we've got GM, BMW, Daimler have obviously pulled back on their mobility, and you've got the cars to go element. There's a lot of huge investment required for autonomous vehicles, the shift towards EV, and obviously you've talked earlier about the OEMs feeling the pinch, but what do you believe there will be an impact from this on mobility trends going forward and the strategies into EV and autonomous vehicles, or not? What's your thoughts?
I think there's a couple of points there, Phil, in particular. Going back to what I said earlier, that I think the manufacturers will want to initially focus on their most profitable vehicles. Now, we all know that EV and hybrid probably don't fall into that category for most of the manufacturers. So, for the auto industry across Europe to return to profitability as quickly as possible, or some form of normality, then I suspect that they'll be lobbying the various European commissions, etc., around the emissions regulations, and perhaps potentially dialing back on wanting to see those being dialed back a little bit, because it will be hard for them to come back to profitability if they're still having to push a lot of alternatively fueled vehicles into the market. And equally, you're right, some of these kind of I think that would just be a minor delay, though, rather than a fundamental change. I think that's just a timing difference, right? I think that that push away from ICE is still going to be present in the market. I think let's call it discretionary spend around some of these other operating models, sharing models, etc. I think that's an area for, if a manufacturer has a choice between investing in some of those or supporting a supplier, to make sure they can continue to make vehicles, I suspect they'll choose the latter at the moment. And again, that's just good common business practice. I'm not really focusing particularly on automotive. That's what I would expect any business to do in that scenario, to kind of trim back their discretionary spend, right? The second element is how the public will react to all of this, and will people want to be doing car sharing, and will people be able to do car sharing, and will the use of Uber and taxis and public transport, will that push more people into personal vehicles because they don't want to be, in a shared space, less than 2 meters with people, getting into a vehicle that's not been deep cleaned in between every time somebody's got in it. You don't know how the public will react to this, and how long things like the social distancing rules will be in place. It could be, if it's 12 months, then a lot of these kind of sharing scenarios, vehicle sharing scenarios, perhaps don't look quite as attractive. But equally, what might look more attractive is some kind of short-term rental scheme where actually you don't really want to buy a car for the next 3 years under a PCP, but actually you do want regular access to a vehicle for the next 6, 8, 9 months, perhaps. So you can see, whenever there's a problem, there's nearly always an opportunity as well, Phil.
Yeah. So potentially there could be some short to medium term impacts based on, one, investment in new strategies, and two, the consumer behaviours around sharing and things like that. But I suppose long term, the move of mobility is a change in terms of the UK, the global environment in terms of the automotive industry, and the EV and alternative fuel is also going to continue. But like you say, this could be a short term to medium term change potentially, but the long term strategies will continue. Would you say?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you look at a lot of consumer studies and things like that, they the environmental issue has certainly raised significantly on people's agenda, on consumers' agendas, right? And I don't think that's fundamentally going to change as a consequence of this. As I said, it might have a short-term blip or a medium-term impact, but longer term, I still think that's the direction of travel, and that's what people will want.
And turning to retailing, Lee, how do you think the UK car retailing sector will emerge from the lockdown? There's been a lot of talk about an acceleration of online transactions. I just wonder if that's something that you agree with.
We were talking to some of our colleagues in China a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that's come, and obviously they're more ahead of us in the COVID curve, so to speak, in the recovery. One of the things, the key messages that came out from that conversation was, all businesses are looking to accelerate the digitalization of their businesses, so that if there's another wave or another pandemic in the future, people's business models are more robust to dealing with online transactions and remote working, etc., etc. So that was a trend that they were seeing, right? So, replicate that into the UK. Yes, I do, but I think that trend was already there pre-COVID, in my view. There's definitely a desire for more online transactions, and I think there was, it depends on the age demographic as well. As to, I think some of the older demographics are going to be less likely, and they're going to want to touch and feel a car before they'll buy it, and that will always be the case. Whereas I think some of the younger demographics, their view is, there's very few bad cars out in the market, in the new market, in the new car space, right? So you go online, and do you even test drive a car anymore? So, a lot of younger people perhaps don't do that, and therefore, that online retail model will get accelerated. And I think it's not just the retail side. If you look at dealers, we were working with a dealer a while ago now, and automation of a lot of the back office is going to be key to reduce cost as well. So, having a good CRM system to enable customers to be contacted, and having an online booking portal to book your car in for a service or its MOT or whatever, that's the direction of travel, and with it, which I think dealers need to be taking to take costs out of their business.
Yeah, and just following on from the online transactions, certainly when people are buying cars, do you think car deliveries for dealers are actually realistic, or would you see click and collect being sort of more cost effective and maybe just as safe?
In the short term or in the longer term, Curtis?
Well, I guess both. In the short term would be of interest now, definitely, yeah.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I just try to think about it in my own personal context. I probably wouldn't be too concerned if someone pulled up on my driveway to deliver a car to me. I can probably stay 2 meters away from that person at all times. They don't have to necessarily sit in the car and tell me how to use the radio or the air conditioning system or whatever. I can probably figure that out for myself. I'm relatively fit and healthy, but other people who perhaps have underlying health issues, they're not going to want people to come anywhere close to them for obvious reasons. And so I don't know. I think both models can work. I think there's a time and a place for both. In reality, dealers probably will become more like fulfillment centers going forwards anyway, where people would order a car, it'll get delivered to the dealer site, and that's a bit like click and collect, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
And I suppose there's an element of cost effectiveness into it as well with some of this, that to deliver a car to a consumer's house, it comes at a cost to the retailer, particularly when you're doing it in a sort of a flatback or covered transporter kind of environment. That there's a cost that some retailers couldn't incur, could they, with the current profit margins available within the sector as well. So there is a little bit of that actually the click and collect controls costs a little bit better for the retailer in a certain way.
Yeah, but look, at the end of the day, if you look at retail generally, I'm not talking just about auto here. A lot of people like the convenience of home delivery, right? But you pay for the privilege. So if you want that new car to be delivered to your door, and you don't want to have to go to the dealer to pick it up, then perhaps the dealers should be charging more for the service, at least covering their costs.
Yeah.
properly covering their costs, Phil. Not, if you're driving a car from Aberdeen to Portsmouth, right, that's not £100, right? Yeah. Whereas if you're driving it from Reading to Bracknell, that's probably not £100 either. So, maybe having a proper model for charging for delivery is the way that dealers will get around that and recover their costs, because a lot of online retailers in the general retail world don't really cover their costs when it comes to online deliveries.
Yeah, very true, very true. So, and finally, now, it's been fantastic having you on, Lee, by the way. Some great insight there. Just the last question really is, in terms of the industry, so there's been various industry calls for a scrappage scheme, the return of the scrappage scheme to obviously stimulate the new car market again. Or do you think that it's more appropriate for more of a captive finance houses to drive showroom activity? What's your view on that? Because the scrappage scheme, the first one, was a costly exercise, wasn't it, when they did it, but it did drive volumes.
I think there's room for both, Phil. If the government is keen for the automotive sector to recover in the UK, and I'm sure it is, then having some form of a scrappage scheme will help to kickstart it again. You could see that they might link a little bit of the environmental agenda to it potentially. So perhaps take off a dirty diesel and put an incentive for an AFV or even an EV in there. You could potentially see some of that happening. But equally, the manufacturers are going to have to shift vehicles. So those with the big captive finance houses, are probably best placed to help incentivize consumers to buy their product, right? At the end of the day, I've been saying to people, I think that post-COVID could be a really good time to buy a new car if you're in the market for one, because I think there'll be some cracking deals around as the captives incentivize us to step in and buy a new car.
Yeah, very true, very true. It's going to be people talk about learnings, but it's certainly going to be an interesting market, isn't it, for the short to medium term as we sort of exit out of this.
Definitely.
Yeah, so Lee, many thanks for joining us today and sharing your perspective with our listeners. It really has been a fascinating chat because it's covered what's happening both upstream with the OEMs and downstream with dealers during these fast changing times. So many thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Lee.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thanks, and goodbye to both of you.
Yep, thank you. So that's all for now. You've been listening to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Please like and share on social media, as it's important during these times for the dealer community to work together and share experiences and best practices. Many thanks to you for listening and supporting the podcast. Philip and I will be back with the industry headlines on Saturday, but do watch out for more special podcast interviews as we work through this crisis. Until then, stay safe and stay well.